This presentation covers the 68-year history of Wakpominee Lodge 48, including written memorabilia, as well as patches, neckerchiefs, and other items. All of the material presented comes from the Twin Rivers Council collection. I tried to go chronologically, but once I got into the patches and neckerchiefs, it's just easier to show all of them at one time. I'll also note that no one ever kept track of the number ordered or the specific years for Lodge insignia. Lodge history begins with the hire Scout executive from Mohican Council in 1980. He established the first summer camp and an honor society to recognize certain campers. Both the camp and society were named Wakpominee, supposedly a Lakota word meaning from whence all good things come. We've been unable to discover both where the name and the meaning comes from. Here is a brief history of the tribe of Wakpominee, obtained mostly from local newspaper records and research for the camp's 100th anniversary. In the fall of 1929, a new Scout executive, Arthur P. Newkirk, an active member of the Order of the Arrow, dissolved the tribe and established an Order of the Arrow Lodge, the 9th created in upstate New York. Here is the office copy of the 1921 application. Copies for these charters exist for most of the next 20 years up into the early 1950s. An unanswered question is where the number 16, which you saw in the first charter, came from. With this 1938 charter application, the 16 is crossed off and 48 is written in. The National Lodge had decreed around 1927 that the numbering would follow the creation of the lodge. And I've talked to some of our national historians as to why there would have been that change, and nobody can figure out why we would have had a 16 in 1930 and kept up through 1937. The 1931 National Lodge meeting was held at Camp Rotary on Lake George, a camp wholly in the Mohican Council, but owned by the Schenectady YMCA, previously jointly with the Schenectady County Boy Scout Council. At that meeting, Newkirk, who was our council executive, ran for the office of vice chief of the National Lodge, but he was not elected. Of course, the heart of any lodge is its members. Here are two members in 1933 at the camp waterfront. The lodge started holding annual banquets in 1937. I have booklets for 4 of the banquets up through 1943. The format that you're looking at here was followed for the first 3 years of banquets, with the lodge activity page dropped after the last 2 booklets. This is the only history that we have besides the charter applications providing information for the lodge. It was a matter of interest. This is a late 1940 staff picture. The tall young man behind the camp cook may be familiar to many of you. He came to Wakpominee from Mohican Lodge 181 before joining the profession and becoming the National OA Secretary in the 1960s. It's a bad picture, but I hope you recognize a very young Dave Boucher. Insignia memorabilia was introduced in the late 1940s or the early 50s. The first patch was a felt arrowhead with a sewn-on tab. The design, the large totem, a sitting gray squirrel. The second patch issue duplicated the first patch without the tab. A third patch used the same design, but it was twill rather than felt. Now there's a distinctive item on the patches, starting with this second patch, that is never made to any of the fakes that I've ever seen. These patches date from somewhere in the late 1940s to the late 1950s. And there are 2 official replicas of this design, which I'll show you later. During the same time, the lodge produced its first neckerchief, a silk-screened local neckerchief. There was no lodge number shown. Screening was done locally, and the process frequently produced faint, smudged, or missing elements. and the cloth used was from at least 2 different sources, as shown by slight color variations in existing neckerchiefs. The neckerchief was not available by 1960 when I joined the lodge. And while shown in some of the online sources, as far as I can see, it's not listed as the lodge first neckerchief. Wakpominee had been one of the original 12 lodges that formed Area 2D in 1950. In 1957, the lodge hosted its first annual conclave for the area, producing a patch and a neckerchief. The manufacturer chosen for the neckerchief had never produced a neckerchief and produced one that was handkerchief sized. Hopefully you can see that because I've placed the 57 neckerchief on top of a 1965 standard size neckerchief. For the patch, the lodge introduced a new emblem to supplement the sitting gray squirrel totem. 4 rings colored red, green, blue, and yellow. The design had been developed by 2 vigil members of the lodge, a youth and an adult, and I'll talk more about that later. And here you can see the first 4 of the 8 conclave patches in which Wakpominee was the service lodge, and the neckerchiefs will follow them. For the 1974 and then later the 95, we introduced a staff neckerchief. Previous conclaves, the local lodge had just added a special sewn border to their existing neckerchiefs, while we did 2 separate ones. The 1980 and 1990 conclaves were also anniversary years for the lodge. The 4 rings were not used in either the 1995, this one, or the 98 designs. The 1998 conclave theme was a farewell message to the other lodge in the sections, since Wakpominee would cease to exist due to a merger at the end of that year. Around the same time, the lodge produced its first flap, black twill with the outline of the squirrel in the center of the flap. Again, there was a problem with the measurements for the flap, and its length is longer than the uniform pocket. This flap was restricted, but I don't know whether the arrowheads before it were also restricted. I believe that the restriction was one for each event attended. The patch was not to be traded or given away. I don't remember new members being able to get the flap at their ordeal, but it was available first to new members at the subsequent winter banquet. After 1960, a new run of the flap was made again. There was a problem with the dimensions, and this flap extended below the shirt pocket flap. The restriction on purpose and use continued. When that run ran out, a third run finally produced a flap that actually fit the pocket. For years, these 3 twill issues were known locally as ghost flaps, since the squirrel was only an outline. And here's the 1930 banquet, which is the year that I joined the lodge and when I was able to get my first lodge flap. And again, going back to our youth, here has 3 of the lodge officers and 2 new members of the lodge at that same time period. Again, for convenience, I'm showing all of the subsequent embroidered flaps at one time. The first of these had an all-white squirrel, but this was replaced by a gray squirrel for all subsequent flaps, with a few exceptions. In 1980, for the lodge's 50th anniversary, the background changed from black to gold, commemorating the 50 years. That flap was only available for that year. The next flap used a gold border to show that the lodge was a 50-year lodge. That was replaced by the white border flap for the subsequent issues. And the youth rep requested that the 4 rings be added to the last 2 flaps that the lodge did. And this last flap, and I just discovered this was a 12th flap. I always thought this was an embroidered flap. Now, patch restrictions finally ended, I believe, in 1978, when at an area conclave, the delegates returning from a swimming session discovered that someone had entered the campsite and cut off the patch flap on every shirt that was hanging up. At the fall weekend, adults convinced a very angry youth membership that it was time to abandon the restrictions. No reason to have people cutting off Scout uniforms. In 1995, Mohican Council celebrated its 75th anniversary. Among the memorabilia issued for that year were 2 large flaps that totally broke with tradition, but matched the design of other memorabilia issued for the event. 2 flaps were issued. The squirrel on the canoe on one was gray and on the other brown. That was an error that led to a lot of looking for those wanting to collect both flaps. Finally, the youth wanted a solid ghost flap and a solid black flap around the same time. Old-timers grumbled that this ghost patch was not really a ghost patch, remembering the outlines that had been done early on. That's something that nobody remembers these days except people like me. And this is the only rejected flap that the lodge did, and that was because the manufacturer switched the color of the letters. Instead of green for the Wakpominee Lodge, they put green for the WWW. And I believe that some of these have still gotten out because they were returned to the manufacturer. Around 1960, the lodge produced a new neckerchief professionally done. This neckerchief used the 4-ring design rather than the lodge totem. Eventually, both designs were used for all subsequent neckerchiefs. I think the neckerchief was also limited to 1 per event, but haven't found anything in writing on this. Now, the reason for both designs, the original design from 1957 had the rings interlocking. Subsequent use of the rings showed overlapping rings, as on this neckerchief. Explanations were distributed with the different neckerchiefs, showing the history of the design and showing that the interlocking lodge links meant that the lodge could not exist without each of the 4 rings dependent on the others. The overlapping design that you have here was said to show that the lodge would collapse if any of the rings was pulled out. Now, again, this neckerchief, as far as I've been able to find, was not shown on the online listings, but it actually should be the N2 for the lodge. The lodge changed the 3rd neckerchief to add a red arrow and changed the background color to a light gray. Subsequent neckerchiefs went to an embroidered neckerchief on a black background. The 5th and the 6th neckerchief also added the lodge totem to this, as well as the fleur-de-lis. You have to look closely to see which neckerchief and patch has an interlocked or an overlapped design. And it's not that easy to be able to find out which was done. I believe the use of a solid black background neckerchief started with Wakpominee. I remember that at the NOAC, after its introduction, it was extremely easy to spot the Wakpominee delegates because they were the only black neckerchiefs that you could see at NOAC. For the 1958 National Order of the Arrow Conference, the lodge produced its first specialty item, a handmade neckerchief. I've never seen one, and this may be the most elusive Wakpominee memorabilia item. I only discovered that this existed this Thanksgiving when one of the delegates, that year's lodge chief, mentioned that he was giving me his neckerchief when he found it. He's still looking. I'll note here that at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show a number of neckerchiefs that have lodge or camp emblems that I don't know what activity they were issued for. So one of those might actually be that neckerchief. There was no special neckerchief produced for the 1961 NOAC, but for the 1963 NOAC, another handmade neckerchief was produced. This is probably the second most elusive Wakpominee memorabilia item. I believe between 6 and 10 neckerchiefs were made by the council executive's wife. Each of the 4 delegates received a neckerchief. I know that the council executive also had a neckerchief, and at least 2 others have surfaced. In 1986, the NOAC neckerchief used the then current lodge neckerchief, adding the NOAC 1986, and that's only the second NOAC neckerchief specifically produced by the lodge that I can date. There were other NOAC delegate neckerchiefs issued using the council travel patch before this one on a colored neckerchief. Unfortunately, no one made a note of which color was used for NOAC or which for jamborees. So those neckerchiefs, as I said, are going to be at the end of the presentation. Starting in 1988, and then again in 92, 94, and 98, there were NOAC delegate flaps. The 1988 flap was produced by Jim Clough, who many of you knew, and delegates were able to purchase them from him. The Lodge subsequently accepted these as official issues. We'll see this happen again for a later item. Now, the 1994 issue was initially designed as a trader, fundraiser, and delegate flap. The youth did not check the trader patches when they arrived and started selling them at Lodge events. I wasn't at the first event that they were selling at, but saw them for the first time at the Lodge banquet. Now, I'm shade blind, but I immediately noted that the manufacturer had changed threads during the run. The youth had no idea how many of each color they had already sold or received, and that set off a mad dash to see that Lodge collectors were able to get both colors, and that's the top two patches. At NOAC, a Lodge member received the highest honor in the individual ceremony competition, so a special flap was ordered to commemorate his achievement. He numbered and signed each flap, and I know that's very difficult to read, and I tried to get it to a better one. When I finish the slideshow, I'll try and show you and see if it's coming through the camera. It shows a little bit better, and you can read what it says. What it actually says at the bottom there is National Champion Alawatsukima on either side of the rings. The Lodge also issued a red jacket with the basic design for the NOAC patch embroidered on the front. In 1970, the Lodge celebrated its 40th anniversary by introducing its first general specialty item, an achievement award that could be earned by any youth member. Unfortunately, this was not a popular item, and only 5 to 10 youth completed the requirements. The remaining patches vanished from storage at the council office without a trace. That year saw Ian Goodman as the guest speaker at the anniversary fall fellowship, and Wakpominee is only about an hour and a half from Goodman's home in Vermont. It was not until 1990 that the Lodge issued another specialty patch. This was another anniversary issue for the Lodge 60th, a large back patch that also celebrated the Camp 60th, the Council 70th, the Order 75th, and the Boy Scout 80th. Shortly after that, Jim Clough again produced commemorative patches, a chenille of the first arrowhead and a chenille of the first flap that the Lodge accepted as special issues afterwards. The Lodge then produced its own back patch flap without the rings, but showing a very industrious squirrel poring over plans for camp improvements and another working on a building project. In 1994, the first in a series of fellowship pocket patches were produced, followed by a similar patch for the Lodge 65th year. Both fellowships were also work weekends, and we call them Beaver Days. So a beaver was added to the patch. And you can see the triangles that were two small triangular patch that were issued for the spring and fall in 1996. And those didn't have room for the beaver. Similar patches were issued in 1997. In 1998, the Lodge returned to the larger fellowship patch for the spring fellowship. In 1998, another octagonal back patch was produced by the council that included the Lodge's 68th year, as well as other anniversaries. This was not a Lodge issue. Many people think that it is, and the difference being that the earlier one had the Lodge totem in the center. This had the then accepted symbol for the camp in the center. Other specialty items produced by the Lodge included an apron for those who volunteered to work in the kitchen. The one that I have here was signed by the entire crew for 1 year. Also, a vigil plaque with the felt reproduction of the second arrowhead glued onto a wooden triangle with the Indian name and vigil date wood burned onto the triangle was given to active vigils. These were donated by the immediate past Lodge advisor, and that lasted only a few years. Unfortunately, the remaining reproduced patches were sold as a separate item. They were only supposed to be used on the plaque, and this is my plaque. The last specialty items that I have were a series of shirts. The first was a cotton long sleeve shirt where members could designate the color of the shirt that they wanted. This one happens to be a white one. I also have a blue one that's packed away. Then came a light gray t-shirt that was available only as recognition for the Alangamets. There was a 1996 delegate special shirt. And then again, while not produced by the lodge, this shirt produced by the section was used for those who staffed the 1995 conclave at Wakpominee. And then the final shirt, again, not a lodge production. This shirt used by the 1998 camp staff paid tribute to the lodge by using both lodge totem and the rings, because this would be the last summer that the lodge would exist at camp. At the 1998 conclave, Loon Lodge, which was one of the two lodges whose initial ordeal was performed by team members from Wakpominee, presented a plaque commemorating the induction and thanking Wakpominee for a fitting farewell gift. And that's what they gave us, which you can see was one of the old 30s or 40s postcards taken at the camp, a drawing of the squirrel, and then a dating from the section vice chief, who was also the chief of Loon Lodge, commemorating the occasion. And that is my screen share. I've got more to be able to talk about, but I'm going to close this to try and show you that other patch. I don't know whether this is coming through any better or not.
We actually could see it pretty well.
Okay, it didn't come through well for me. Now, as I said before, I have 9 neckerchiefs that could be lodge related. And I'm going to go back to the screen sharing and show you those. I'm showing them in what should be the earliest first based on the patch on the neckerchief. Now, this is the first lodge neckerchief that's been cut and then sewn onto a red square neckerchief. This one used the patch that was used from the late 40s through the early 50s, sewn onto a plaid neckerchief. This one has the twill arrowhead, again, onto a plaid neckerchief. And this one has a patch that was used in the mid-50s after they abandoned the orange, reddish-orange patch. And then finally, for the plaid, this was the patch that was used from about 1960 to 1965, or one of the patches, again, on a plaid neckerchief. Now, this becomes the travel patch that was introduced somewhere in the late 60s. That was supposed to be used on Jamboree and NOAC and any other national event if the council sent a delegation. This one I'm pretty certain was for one of the NOACs, but not 100% certain. And then you get ones with other colors. So this shows what happens when you don't write down details before your memory starts to fade for you young fellows. Now, there may be some other items that I either don't have or didn't find when preparing this. Also, in the interest of time, I didn't include copies of the Lodge newsletter, the Squirrel's Tale, or any of the mugs either the Lodge or the Conclave issued by the Lodge. I understand that there was an armband at some point. I think I have one, but I didn't find it, so I didn't include it in showing it. I believe that it is on the OA Images site. And there may also be variant patches that I haven't seen that are included on OA Images. I'll search for those. And there may be some other shirts that are packed away that I didn't uncover. There are 2 items that are reported as Wakpominee pieces that aren't. The first is a council camporee patch from 1953 that says Wakpominee Lodge. That was noting the construction of the new dining hall, and that was the Wakpominee Lodge. And it had no relation to the lodge and is not a lodge issue, even though it's sometimes listed as one. The other is a leather item with a squirrel that has absolutely no provenance to justify a claim as a lodge issue. It regularly appears on eBay at an outrageous price. I didn't check it today, but I've seen it for well over $1,000. It may indeed be a private piece, but it has neither the lodge name, the council name, the city, nor the number on it. It has a squirrel that doesn't match any squirrel design used by the lodge. nor does it have the one special identifying feature that has never been duplicated. One simply can't say a piece is related to a specific lodge without some sort of documentation. Otherwise, any piece that shows what is claimed as a lodge totem can be called a lodge piece. Jim Clough was vociferous in denying the claim that this was a Wakpominee piece, and I agree with him. And this is shown on OA images as a lodge piece. And as I say, there's only one that anybody's ever found. And it has just a white, big fat squirrel sitting on it. We don't know when it was from, where it came from. It's been on since, as far as I can remember, Arapahoe started doing pictures of lodge items. And Jim had long discussions with Al Hogan, who isn't on tonight, that I see, about that piece. So, any questions?